So we have about 90 minutes today, and I want to start with a little quiz. This is a 101 session, a very basic session. One of the goals is just to define some jargon, but we're going to use some jargon in this quiz just so I can get a feel for where you all are before we dive in. But just a reminder that this is very much a 101 session. It's going to be a beginner session, and that means a lot of the issues we talk about today that are quite complicated, we're going to be talking about some generalities. And just understand that there will be, caveats and exceptions and political angles on a lot of the things we talk about. I'll try to point out some of those as we go, but remember that this is kind of an introductory session, and so we can only go so deeply into some of those. But with that caveat, let me start with a little quiz here while I got you all on. And just a reminder, somebody who joined late may not have heard the plea to mute your phone by hitting *6. I can just hear a little bit of background noise. If at all possible, please go ahead and hit *6 to mute yourself. All right, so with that, let's do our quiz. So raise your hand if you have ever commented on a NPDES or Clean Water Act point source permit. Raise your hand if you've ever done that. All right, it looks like we have a decent group here, maybe a quarter to a third of the people have actually commented on a permit. Okay, go ahead and unraise your hand. The next question is, raise your hand if you're here today because you have a specific facility or facilities in mind that you would want to maybe look at their permit. Maybe they comment on a new permit or just see the status of their permit. You have a specific facility in mind you're a little concerned about. Okay, so about the same number of people, looks maybe a little more like a third to, not quite half of you, but more than a third of you are thinking about a place in particular. That's great. You'll be able to think about how to apply some of these things as we go. All right, so unraise your hand if you would, if it was up. These next ones are going to test your ability to use chat. So chat and answer into the little chat box if you know what the acronym NPDES stands for. It's on the slide here in front of you. I can see people are typing. Let's see who's the fastest typist might be the winner here. It says multiple attendees are typing, so... Oh my gosh, we got a lot of these. We got yes, okay. Forest says National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, and then we have, boy, a lot of you. So probably more like half of you were able to answer that. Okay. Another question for chat. Do you know who it is that largely monitors the point source discharges we'll be talking about today? Lots of people do, but who has primary responsibility for checking at the end of, say, a discharge pipe to see what's going on as it relates to the permit? Okay. People are saying mostly agency answers here, but I see a few people, it looks like Lois and a few others. The primary responsibility we'll see as we go usually falls to the facility. There's a lot of self-monitoring involved in the system we'll talk about today. Of course, the agencies are doing monitoring as well, but in terms of the daily or weekly or regular monitoring of the discharge itself, it's the permitted facility in large part. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. If there's somebody on the line that just joined us and hasn't yet muted their phone, please go ahead and do that by hitting *6 to avoid background noise. Thank you. All right, last question. Who knows how often a permit in this system is supposed to be reviewed and renewed? Use the chat to put an answer in if you do. Boy, Forrest is a fast typist. Either that or he got a copy of the quiz ahead of time. Robert, Chris, okay, a couple answers here. So 5 years is right. So every 5 years, these permits are supposed to be updated and renewed. All right, well, looks like we have some folks with some good basic knowledge. Now, remember, this is a 101 session, so we're going to be covering a lot of the basics. If there's, more intermediate topics that come up as time allows, we will address those. This is a pretty basic session. So if you didn't know the answers to any of those questions, don't worry about it. That's the kind of stuff we're going to be covering in this session. It just gives me a good idea here of the speed at which to go as we cover it. So with that, let's dive into our agenda for today. Again, this is a 101 session, so what we're going to do is do an introduction to the issues in front of us, which is basically point source discharges and the Clean Water Act's program for regulating those. We're going to talk a little bit about how watershed groups, river groups, citizens, and others can influence these permits, kind of an action focus. We're going to touch on some issues related to enforcing these permits, so making sure that they're complied with. Everybody knows it's having a permit or a plan is one thing, but actually doing something with it is another, and enforcement is part of that action focus we're going to have today. We're going to briefly touch on some special issues in permitting, mostly just to give you an idea of some of the more intermediate to advanced topics that are out there, things that you may hear about even as a beginner that you should just be aware of. We're not going to go into any intense detail on those. And then we're going to wrap up with some ideas for taking action with this information and some additional resources so you could maybe go from the 101 level to the 201 and beyond. So that is our agenda for today. My goal is that when you leave here, you're going to have a comfort with the basic jargon of permitting, a basic understanding of when and how you could influence permitting, have, I would say hands-on, but in this format it's more eyes-on experience with some of the basic elements of a permit. We'll actually look at a few pieces of a permit. And you'll understand a little bit more about how permits are enforced and, again, kind of how you could be involved with that. And most importantly, hopefully have some ideas you could take home to use in your watershed. So those are kind of my goals for the presentation, and I'm hoping that's why you signed up. I should mention, too, that this session is kind of a preliminary session to a more advanced session next Monday, the 10th, focused on stormwater permitting. And I'll give you some more information about that session at the end if you're not already RSVP'd for it. It's a session, that, again, that will help you take this to the next level. So for people on the phone line, remember that you need to mute yourself. We can hear your conversations, so hit *6 if you don't want to share it with the world, and it also just helps avoid distraction for other people. All right, well, let's dive into this introduction with a little bit of context here. I always like to start with kind of placing the subject of the day in the context of the Clean Water Act itself. As most of you on the phone would know, the Clean Water Act is our national law that addresses water quality. So it really establishes the national policy for how we're going to protect and restore our rivers, lakes, wetlands, coastal waters, etc. The Clean Water Act's objective is very broad and kind of visionary. It was, the act was established in its current form, or most of its current form, in 1972. You can see that the objective is for that time pretty broad and sweeping. It's to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our waters. So a lot of what we'll talk about and what you'll hear about in the permitting world is the chemical quality of our water. But it's important to remember as we have these discussions that it's broader than that. It's the chemical stuff that you'll often see in permits, but it's also the physical integrity and the biological integrity of our systems. And that can be important to keep in mind even in the permitting context. What is a particular discharge doing that might affect the physical nature of a stream or river, or the biological kind of aspects, the fish and the aquatic macroinvertebrates, the bugs there that support the entire system. So that's just to place it in the broadest context. The other text on this slide is kind of a paraphrasing of some of the relevant goals in the Clean Water Act. I picked out two here that are particularly relevant to our topic today. One is that the Act in 72 established as a national goal that by 1983 all of our waters would be fishable and swimmable. And what they meant by that was fishable means that these rivers and lakes and wetlands will support healthy fish population and all the aquatic life and vegetative life necessary to keep those fish communities happy. So it's not just about whether or not you can catch a fish. It's really about those healthy aquatic ecosystems. And by swimmable, what we really mean is that our waters will be safe for recreation in and on the water. So, that you won't get sick if you go swimming or if you tip your canoe over. So by 1983, that was our goal. Most of you on the phone will know that that was not achieved by 1983, which is, kind of disheartening. On the other hand, it's still our national goal, and it's important to keep that in mind as we're thinking about the minutiae of permitting. The other one that seems relevant to today's discussion is that Congress said that by 1985 we would eliminate pollution discharge to our waters. Clearly a goal that we didn't achieve, but you can hear that goal echoed in the name of the permitting system we're talking about today, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. It's built right into the program we're talking about. And I like to remind myself of that when I'm advocating for tighter permit limits, et cetera, that we're really supposed to be talking about moving in the direction of this elimination. So that's just for some big picture context. This next slide is my last big picture context slide. Can anybody chat me, or if you want to unmute yourself, tell me what river this might be? I can see people. Yep, you can see in the chat. I always say this wrong. I'm from Michigan. I should be able to say it, but it's the Cuyahoga River that caught on fire. It was part of the motivation for the establishment of the Clean Water Act in '72. Tim says many rivers in the country. Um, it wasn't only Ohio that had this problem. The Congress was facing some pretty egregious, remarkable point source kind of pollution problems from industry, from wastewater treatment plants. This was the kind of thing that was front and center when they were drafting this law and establishing the permit program we're going to be talking about today. So in terms of context, I put this slide up to remind us that, under the Clean Water Act and particularly under the program we're talking about today, the Point Source Permitting Program, we have made great strides. It's been a very successful program in a lot of ways. However, it's not perfect. There are still plenty of problems with discharges from the facilities we'll be talking about today, industrial and wastewater treatment plants, that kind of thing. And I want to kind of make the case through this presentation that the key to getting at those remaining problems is really having people like you all, watershed groups, river advocates, and others that use the Clean Water Act to its full kind of power and bring it to bear on the problems that we still have. Oh, here's an interesting factoid. Heidi says there were 29 rivers since 1950 that burned. I've never heard that particular number, but I know it was more than just one in Ohio, so that's an interesting factoid, Heidi. All right, so there's our general context. I want to get into a little more specifics now in the introduction to our topic today, which is permitting point source pollution under the Clean Water Act. So we're going to do three things in this section. We want to do some definitions, both of what is a point source of pollution, and then what is this NPDES program that we've been talking about. So we're going to define those. We're going to talk about the two basic types of permits that exist in the Clean Water Act world. Those are individual and general permits. We'll talk about the differences and kind of the pros and cons of those two types of permits. And then we're going to talk about kind of the heart of these permits, which is the discharge effluent limits. So we're going to go into those in a little more detail. So those are going to be the topics for our introduction here. In this first slide, we're going to define a point source. So I want you to just take a second here and imagine in your world, in your head, how you would define what a point source of pollution is. This point source term is defined in the Clean Water Act. We're going to talk about how the regulations define it. But just take a second to think about it. If you want to chat, in a word or two, how would you define point source? Might be interesting to see what people put up there. Like, put it in your mind and think through how you might define that. I can see that people are typing away here. So people say things like pollution from a pipe and from an identified point, out of a pipe, a conveyance. I like this one, a pollution source that I can clearly point to. Lots of variation on pipe or identified point. So it sounds like we all have a kind of joint definition in our brain of point source. And you're going to see that you guys are right, and there's more. So this is very text heavy, so I broke the definition up here because I really wanted you to see it, even though it's a lot of text. So in the regulations that kind of take the Clean Water Act and better define them and are used for implementing the program, point source is first defined as any discernible, confined, and discrete conveyance. So conveyance was something that came up in your chat answers, and you can see, okay, that's kind of a legal way of saying, okay, a point, something that's moving water and waste. So that kind of makes sense. And then it goes on to provide a list of examples, and you can see here some of the things that you all came up with, like a pipe, or I think somebody, I don't know if we said tunnel, somebody said another version on that though. A ditch, a channel, those are the kinds of things you might have had in your mind if you were envisioning a point source. But you can see the list is longer than some of those more obvious examples. So things like concentrated animal feeding operations, vessels, so ships, things like that are also included in this example. And it says including but not limited to, I would point out. But still, it's a very broad definition when you get into these examples. And that's something to keep in mind and something we'll see as we talk about things like concentrated animal feeding operations. So that's a nice broad kind of vision for what a point source is. And then it adds this language of from which pollutants are or may be discharged. So, any facility just sitting there is not necessarily a point source unless they are discharging pollutants or there's a chance that they may be discharged. And that's important to keep in mind because some facilities, you could argue whether or not they're going to discharge. I think the most important thing here is the may be discharged, in my mind, means several things, but one of them is it does not need to be discharging every second of every day. So we'll see some examples of the fact that some of these facilities aren't like your traditional, say, industrial facility that you think of discharging pretty much 24/7. Um, they might discharge when it rains, that kind of thing. Um, so that's the general definition, but because, of course, the Clean Water Act and its regulations exist in a political world, they end with exemptions. So things that are not point sources, even though they may appear to any rational person looking at the rest of this definition to be a point source. And those you'll see here are return flows from irrigated agriculture, big where I live in Utah, or agricultural stormwater runoff, so just your typical runoff off of, say, an agricultural field. So those are important to keep in mind. Those are very explicitly exempted in terms of this definition of a point source. So we're gonna do a little quiz here. It's a little challenging because you can't see the whole world of the pictures I'm going to put up here, but I'm going to show you some pictures and ask you to raise your hand if you think it is a point source. So here is your first picture. Use the raise your hand function if you think that this is a point source. Looks like we're having pretty strong agreement here that this is likely a point source. Yeah. Okay, so the majority of you, which I imagine is everybody who's found that raise your hand button, say yes, this is a point source. And it's true. This is actually, it's kind of weird. It's an intake and an outflow pipe. The pipe on the left is the outflow, and the intake for this facility is on the right. But this is, in fact, a point source, kind of the more traditional version of a pipe that you might see. So unraise your hand if you have it up, because I'm going to quiz you again here. So how about this discharge point? Do you think that this is a point source of pollution? Raise your hand if you think so. We're getting more mixed bags and people changing their minds here. Okay, well, I will tell you this one is a little tricky because, again, you can't see the whole context, but this is actually technically an irrigation return flow. So it would be one of those exemptions that we saw in the definition. Of course, you couldn't be sure of that. I tried to get a picture that included the ag fields behind to give you something to guess on. But you can see you'd have to really understand the context of what is this and where is that water coming from. So last example, raise your hand if you think that this is a point source of pollution. Okay, getting more hands up on that one. Yes. Okay. So again, without context, it's a little challenging, but this is a concentrated animal feeding operation, and so it would be included in that definition of point source, even though it doesn't necessarily look like that pipe we saw in the first picture. So it looks like people have a decent handle on that concept of a point source. So I'm going to move on here. If you have any questions, again, feel free to chat them, or we're going to stop in a few slides here. And it takes some time for verbal questions if you have them. So with that little quiz behind us, let's talk, we've defined a point source. Let's talk a little bit about the definition of the program that regulates point sources under the Clean Water Act. So again, that's called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or the NPDES program, you'll often hear people say. And states often will do a variation on that name. For example, here in Utah, we call it UPDES because it's the Utah Pollution Discharge Elimination System. But it'll be something along those lines. And this is the program that, again, controls point source pollution. And the application of the program has really evolved over the years. You'll hear a lot as you get more involved in the program about how, traditionally it was really about those industrial pipes and how it's really the application of it, although it's been there on the books for a long time, the application of the program has really evolved over the years to include more focus on things like concentrated animal feeding operations and stormwater and other issues. One important thing to know about this program is that it is largely delegated to the states to run. This is true of a lot of Clean Water Act programs. In the Clean Water Act structure, it is a federal law and it's a federal system. But for a lot of the day-to-day work, states can apply to have the program delegated to them, and they run the day-to-day details of it, with EPA retaining oversight. So EPA still establishes those national regulations and kind of expectations, and they also can review and kind of oversee the actions of the states. But especially in the case of the NPDES program, most of the states have taken over the program and run it themselves. The exceptions are New Mexico, Idaho, the District of Columbia, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. So in those states, EPA actually still writes the discharge permits, but everywhere else, your state, or in some cases, your tribal governments, could be taking over control of that program. The bottom line of this program, when the act was, kind of put in place, is that the program makes it illegal to discharge without a permit. Um, so it's not illegal to discharge pollutants, but it is illegal to do so if you're a point source without a permit. So what that means is there's a lot of work to be done around what those permits are, what's in them, because they are the mechanism for controlling pollution into our waterways. So what are these permits like? Well, I mentioned at the overview of this section that there's two basic types of permits in the Clean Water Act world. Um, one of them is an individual permit. The other is the general permit. So taking the individual permit first, this is an individual permit is basically what you probably think of when you think of a permit. And that is, for a specific facility, you get a specific permit that is specifically designed for that facility. So it would have, facility-specific limits on what can be discharged, facility-specific monitoring requirements, and maybe best management practices. There'd be a lot of, very tailored requirements in that individual permit. And that is what we think of for most of these types of permits. You can see in the Clean Water Act world that a lot of the larger dischargers, these major kind of dischargers, and municipal wastewater treatment plants will get individual permits, and some others will as well. Stormwater discharges may, although typically you'll see general permits, and some others may as well. Often that's based on, maybe a particularly large facility that would otherwise get a general maybe triggers an individual, or there's just a lot of public concern and people apply a lot of pressure saying, no, we want an individual permit here. So there are other facilities, but generally speaking, you'll see this for these wastewater treatment plants and larger industrial dischargers. So again, it's a very specific permit for a specific facility. Probably the most important thing about these individual permits is that each permit gets individual attention in terms of public comment and requirements for public input. So if a new facility is proposed in your neighborhood and they are in an individual permit setting, you would see public notice about that facility and have a chance to comment specifically about that facility's permit and what they should or shouldn't do on site, that kind of stuff. We'll talk more about public notice and look at some of those later, but it's the real chance that people have to weigh in the Clean Water Act structure on what will be required at a facility. And you get an individual and site-specific opportunity to do that with individual permits. In the alternative, you have general permits. These permits are general, like their name suggests. They're essentially permits that are crafted for a group of operations or facilities that are similar in nature. The argument is they'll have a similar discharge, kind of waste stream. They probably have the same effluent limits on their discharge or conditions that are put in place, like best management practices that are required, things like how they manage, say, manure in the case of this CAFO pictured here, and they'll have similar monitoring requirements. So a general permit is crafted for that whole group of similar operations, and then people apply to be covered under the general permit. So instead of having one permit, one facility, you have one permit, and you might have 10 or 100 facilities that apply for coverage under that general permit. You can see that this is a resource and time saver particularly for the state agencies. Instead of drafting those 10 to 100 permits, they do one, and then they just approve people to be covered under it. The downsides are these, of course, the obvious ones are the requirements are not specific to a facility. So you're kind of saying, these cookie cutter protections we feel will protect in all these situations, and sometimes that might not be true. Facilities can be quite different. Um, Most fundamentally, unlike individual permits, you do not get a chance to comment publicly. The public doesn't get a chance to comment on these individual applications to be covered under a general permit. So when the general permit is drafted, it does go out for public comment, and you have a chance to weigh in. But once that permit is in place, let's say it's a permit for concentrated animal feeding operations established at the state level. It's been out for public comment, it's finalized. Then, you know, I'm living in Armada, Michigan, the state of the permit, and a facility wants to move in 2 houses down from me. I do not have a chance to comment on that facility's permitting decisions. It's covered under the general permit. The public comment has already happened on the general permit, and there's not a mechanism for me to get in and comment on um, their specific request. So you can see that for the public and for the conservation community is a real handicap. It's a real kind of trade-off between this resource savings of the general permits versus the public input and involvement restrictions that come into play with general permits. So those are the two basic types of permits. There's a lot of details under each of those, but for this 101 session, that's the basics. The other basic but important topic that I wanted to touch on in this introductory session was kind of the heart of the permit. Whether you have an individual permit or a general permit, arguably the most important part of that permit is the effluent limits section. And we'll look at some of these a little bit later. But the basic idea of effluent limits is they establish what can be discharged by the permitted facility. So they limit what can come out of that pipe or other mechanism, and kind of are enforceable mechanisms in the permit to limit that. So when a permit writer is drafting a permit, they have a couple options for how to establish those limits on a discharger. The main two ways, and there's some others that have developed over time, but the main two ways are technology-based effluent limits and water quality-based effluent limits. So I want to talk about technology-based first. And these are limits that basically the intent is to require a minimum level of treatment for pollutants for any point source discharger based on available treatment technologies. This is one of the kind of big shifts in the 1972 Clean Water Act. It said, we're going to establish some basic expectations nationwide on what can be achieved in terms of treatment based on, available technology. We're not going to say a discharger has to use that technology, but they have to get at least as clean in their discharge as that available technology would deliver. And that's going to be how we establish the limits. And the beauty of this is it establishes kind of a nationwide level playing field. The important thing to remember is that was intended to be a floor, so nobody should be able to duck under that floor, but a state or a regulating entity can always require more. So those are the technology-based standards are kind of the floor. So these things can be a little mysterious, these effluent limits, so I just want to at least touch on where they come from in terms of the technology-based effluent limits. There's a couple places. For industrial dischargers, there is a set of national effluent limitation guidelines. These are established by EPA, and they're established by industry. So for different industry types, you will have an actual established kind of, this is what we think the available technology can deliver in terms of discharge, and you should be able to at least meet that. This screenshot here that I give you is the EPA page where they have these national effluent limitation guidelines available, and you can see the URL up there. I'll leave it up for a minute if people are interested. So you can go, and it's not every industry ever, but it's a surprisingly broad range of industries that these have been established for. So you can go if you're interested in a particular industry and see what EPA has established. And if you're looking at a permit, you can compare, see if they're using the right effluent limits. Um, so for a lot of industries, this is the place that a permit writer would really start in terms of establishing technology-based effluent limits. Um, the other way that they might establish these limits, though, is best professional judgment. So not, these limits don't exist for every possible industry you could ever imagine. And they take a long time to develop and update. So as new industries come into play, there's definitely a lag time. So permit writers can, on a case-by-case basis, use what's called best professional judgment to establish effluent limitations based on technology. That's a harder thing to really get your head around, but it is done, and you really have to, at that point, really be able to talk to the permit writer and try to understand what they've done. If they've looked at, say, what other similar facilities are achieving. They might start with that. If they've looked at literature, there's lots of different ways that they might, in their professional judgment, build a case for whatever they're proposing for an industry that isn't otherwise on this list. So keep that in mind. These national effluent limitation guidelines are the main source, but there's also this best professional judgment idea. Now, going back to this slide, the other group, that's for industrial facilities, but for wastewater treatment plants, technology-based effluent limits are largely based on the National Secondary Treatment Standards. And so here's a similar screenshot where you can go to this website and learn more about secondary treatment standards. This is basically for wastewater treatment plants. EPA has established these standards for some of the core parameters that are discharged by wastewater treatment plants, and just established them as the national floor, again, for what a facility has to achieve. These don't by any means address everything. They address pH and total suspended solid and 5-day BOD, things like that, if you're familiar with wastewater. But not everything that might be coming out of a wastewater treatment plant. But they are the baseline for what a permit would address in terms of a wastewater treatment plant. So again, you can see the web address here if you want to learn more about secondary treatment standards and get a feel for where those numbers are really coming from in your permits. And we'll see examples. I think the example effluent limitations that I have are wastewater treatment plants, so we'll actually see some of the secondary treatment standards in action a little later in the presentation. So I think that's a lot of talking at this point, so I'm going to take a pause here at the end of this section and see if there are any questions. You can chat them, or you can hit *6 to unmute yourself and ask them verbally, which is very welcome because I talk too much. Any questions? I see some typing. Just pause here and let people type for a second. Okay. It says, here's a question from Charlene. Around here, most people consider recreational boats with MSDs a non-point source. Is that incorrect? Charlene, you'll have to define MSD for me. I don't know what that is. I'm thinking marine sanitation device? Yes. That's a pretty specific example. We might have to talk offline about that. Vessels, generally are included in that point source description. My guess is that you're talking about things that are small enough that they're not going to be triggering the kinds of programmatic stuff we're talking about today. But I'd be curious, maybe if you're interested, you could call or email and we could talk about it in more detail. So Nicole says, you said that T-bells take a long time to develop, the technology-based effluent limits. How long and what is that process like? I don't think I could possibly say, on an average, how long they take. The Natural Resources Defense Council has been very involved in pushing development of these over the years, and it often involves litigation to get the clock kind of rolling forward on this. The years and years has been, I think, the typical example of how long it has taken, and it's a national kind of EPA process with public comment and rulemaking, and it's a quite intense and long process at the federal level. So I'm not sure if that's what you meant by what is the process like. Probably the most important thing is there is public involvement and input. Another question here, are there any population limitations to NPDES requirements? I wonder, yeah, Forrest says this too. Heidi, if you're thinking of stormwater issues, there are some ways that population really plays into the stormwater permitting world. Not so much for just like say wastewater treatments or industrial facilities. So if you're thinking of stormwater permits, we'll touch on that very briefly in this presentation, but I'd really encourage you to go to the we're in December 10th webinar specifically on stormwater, where Gail Killam, my colleague, will get into the details of what happens, what population means and why it matters in stormwater permitting world. Okay. Well, that was good. I'm so glad you guys have questions. Anything else before we move along here to the next section? All right. Well, if anybody did unmute yourself, remember to hit *6 to remute yourself. Thank you guys for being so good about that. We usually have somebody forget and some kind of bad feedback. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next section. If other questions occur to you, please feel free to bring them up. This next section is this is my favorite. It's about action. It's about actually influencing permits. So we've only scratched the surface in terms of some of the details of the program, but I want to, in this 101, make sure that we do, largely focus on what you can do with the program. So we're going to talk about when you can comment on permits and kind of how to influence them, because sometimes it's not just commenting. We're going to do a little bit of an introduction to reviewing permits, which will include this look at a few examples of different pieces of public notice and effluent limits. And then we'll talk a little bit about submitting comments. Um, so when can you comment? The best answer to that is as early as possible. If there's any way to get involved before a permit actually comes out for public notice, you're going to benefit from that. So it can be hard to know when an application process is beginning. The best way is probably just to find out who's working on permits in your state agency and get to know them. Tell them what kinds of things particular types of facilities you're worried about, or a particular geographic area. They might be willing to just let you know when they're starting to hear about a proposal. The other thing is just keeping your ear to the ground in your community. So watershed groups in particular often know about these types of particularly new facilities before anybody else does, because they're living in the community. So if you hear about a new industrial facility that's contemplating moving in, or the expansion of the wastewater treatment plant, that would be the time to start talking with your state agency or EPA if you're in one of the non-delegated states, and talking to the discharger if you can. Short of that, the main place where people really start to get involved often is the public notice on the draft permit. So I'm going to show you one of these public notices on the next slide. But what a public notice does is it officially opens the public comment period. This is often for 30 days, so it gives you, a window to comment. Sometimes it can be longer in certain cases, but 30 days is kind of the norm. So the public notice, which we'll look at next, is the main way you'll know that these are available to comment. Another forum you may have for commenting is a public hearing on a permit. Public hearings are not always held. They're not held as a matter of course. They're kind of resource intensive and time intensive for the agency. But most states, if you look at your state program, have some kind of trigger for public hearings. There's usually a way that you can request one on a proposed permit or a renewal, and some kind of threshold. Often it's significant public interest. It's pretty vague, but if you're a watershed group and you really want a public hearing, you could do a little bit of organizing and really try to get that significant public interest kind of underway to trigger a public hearing. Those are, just a chance to register your concerns in public, verbally with the agency. Sometimes they're more of a discussion depending on the format. Another way to comment. The last two bullets here are things we're not really going to address in this beginner 101 session, but just so you all know, other ways that you can kind of weigh in on permits include appealing a permit. So if a decision is made on a permit that you or others do not agree with, the permit can be appealed, usually within a tight time window after issuance, something like 30 days. But it can be done, and so you can challenge particular parts of the permit that way, or the permit, just the issuance of the permit by appealing it. And it's permits are are occasionally reopened as well. They can be modified. One of the more typical examples you might hear is in a total maximum daily load situation where a watershed restoration effort is underway. One of these TMDLs is established and it triggers some changes to the permit. Those might be the kinds of things that would cause a permit to be opened in the middle of its permit term. Remember that these permits are issued for a 5-year term. So, once that public comment window closes, unless you're going to appeal it or by some chance it's reopened, it's in place for at least 5 years. In many cases, those permits are not actually renewed at the 5-year mark. Many states are far behind in the renewal process, and they do what's called administrative I'm sorry, I just got distracted by the chat window. They administratively extend those permits so that they can continue to operate while the agency has them in line for an update of their permit. So you're going to be with that permit for at least 5 years, maybe quite a bit longer than that. So those are the basic kind of opportunities for public comment. Let's look at one of these public notices to see what you're gonna find if you see one. So the first question, before we even look at this in detail, is how can you get these public notices? How many of you get public notices on NPDES permits? Raise your hand if you're already receiving these notices. Oh, looks like quite a few of you. Yeah, okay, maybe a fourth or a little bit more. That's great. Okay, so you can request, your state agency distributes these public notices as a regular matter of course. They have a system that you can plug into. Many states now will email them. This is an example of an old-fashioned mailed one. I can see it's a little dated there. If you just Google your state agency for NPDES permitting, if you don't already know their URL, they should have, somewhere on their website, they will explain how to get on the public notice list for NPDES permits. If you have any problem with that, feel free to give me a call. I'd be happy to help you kind of navigate it. But again, usually you'll get these emailed these days, or you might actually sign up for a physical mailing list. One of the challenges is, in many states, you get all of the public notices for the state. I do here in Utah. You can't just select a few. You get them all. But in some states, you can, kind of focus in on a region of the state or even a watershed. So, do some sleuthing around to see if you can save yourself some agony in terms of getting overwhelmed. If you can't, though, you're going to want to do some sort of triage of these. So let's look at some of the factors that you can find in a public notice that might help you figure out whether or not you want to know more about a proposed permit. So who can tell me which river this facility is discharging into? Who can chat that? Or if you want to *6, shout it out. The Malad, that's right. A lot of you got that. So, okay, the Malad River, if you haven't found it yet, you can see it there kind of in the center of the page, is where this is discharging to. So if I cared about the Malad or, some areas downstream, that might be one reason why I would pull this public notice out of the pile. Another might be if it's a big discharge. You might decide, boy, I can't comment on everything, but if it's a big discharge, I want to take a look at it. So who can tell me how much this facility is proposing to discharge? Anybody see that anywhere? Yeah, we're both cool. So that did no good. Okay, a lot of you got that, 2 million gallons a day. So here it is. Great. And somebody needs to hit *6, somebody who's in a happy office with lots of laughing. That's great. 2 million gallons a day is right. I'm going to pause and answer a question on chat. It was a question about what about where EPA writes the permits. EPA does issue public notices on those permits, and so you can go to the EPA website to find the way to get on the list. And again, I'm happy to help you if you have a problem with that. But that's a good clarifier. Anywhere where EPA is doing the permits, you'd go to them. Okay, so this isn't a huge facility, 2 million gallons per day. Some of you in the east will probably laugh at that idea even. But for this stream, that's actually a pretty big discharge. So I might still be interested. Maybe most importantly, in terms of triage, figuring out if you're going to engage, is when comments are due. So who can tell me when comments are due on this permit? All right, you guys are fast. May 7th, that's right, 2008. So if I was doing triage, I missed it. So But yeah, that's another important piece of information you can always find in public notices. They have to tell you kind of when the comments are due and where and how you can submit them, which you can also see here. Gives you some details about how you can get more information, etc. So these public notices are very short, but there is a lot of important information in there, particularly if you're trying to sort through and see which ones you might be really interested in. So with that, that's kind of our little example of a public notice. Let's say you decide after looking at this that you're interested in the City of Tree Mountain's proposal to renew their discharge to the Malad River, their permit. What would you want to do next? Here's my short list for what you'd want to gather. You definitely want that public notice. There is something called the Statement of Basis, or in some states they call it a fact sheet, which summarizes a lot of information about the permit. You probably would want to request that from the state agency if it's not included already up on their website. And of course the proposed permit. That's what you're commenting on. Again, it may already be available on the agency's website. If not, you would want to request that. And then in cases where it's a renewal, you probably would want the previous permit so you can compare and see how things are changing. If like say those discharge limits are getting looser or tighter, you would want to know that, maybe comment. And then this last bullet is discharge monitoring reports. We'll talk a little bit more about those and look at one later, but those can be really important for figuring out kind of what is the history of this discharger? What kinds of problems have they been having? And how might that change what I want to say in terms of comments? Do they need to do more monitoring because they clearly have some sort of problem, for example? Or, there's lots of things that you might turn up in those monitoring reports. So we'll look at those, example of those a little bit later. But so the core things, the public notice we've already looked at. I also want to look a little bit at just a piece or two of a proposed permit if you were deciding that this is one you're going to look at. So let's look at what we would see inside the permit. So if we've got the proposed permit now, there's a lot of different sections in there. This is kind of a gross generalization. But everyone will have a cover sheet that'll summarize, again, some of the base information. It'll have those discharge limits, the effluent limits we talked about earlier, which are really the heart of the requirements in a lot of the permits. They'll have monitoring requirements that you'll probably want to look at. And then they'll also have some additional requirements. Well, some permits will. For example, we won't go into this, but some permits that are, say, for a wastewater treatment facility will have a whole section on biosolids kind of drawn out, or stormwater, the topic of the December 10th session. So you may see some additional sections that get into more detail on specific topics. And then they'll also have what we call boilerplate language. This is language that usually is just kind of cut and paste from permit to permit. It includes things like, we have another need to hit *6 to mute. You can hear discussion in the background somewhere. The boilerplate language, again, kind of cut and paste language usually about things like their duty to report a spill, say how soon they have to do it, and maybe who they have to call, and how they have to report that information. So this is language that is usually very consistent from permit to permit. I put boilerplate language in quotes, though, a little bit because it's not always so boilerplate. I won't go into examples here, but sometimes there are kind of sneaky and or accidental changes that sneak into boilerplate language. So you might want to look at those and compare to see which ones are causing problems or are changing, and see if it might just be a mistake or if there's something that's going on with those changes. So Ryan, I'm getting feedback through the chat that the audio is spotty. I don't know if you can do anything about it. I think part of the problem might be there's someone who is not muted. And if there's any way we can identify who that is, we might need to cut them off, because I can hear them cutting in and out. Oh, some people say the audio is good. Okay. Well, we'll try to get a handle on that. Again, if you're not muted, please do hit *6 because you're affecting everyone's quality of audio. I think that might be the root of it. Okay, well, I'm going to move on and hope my guru can solve that for you all. I apologize for any sound problems. And somebody still is not muted, Ryan, so I don't know if the all mute didn't work or not. All right. Well, I'm going to move on here and look at our example. So we talked here about the different permit elements. What I want to focus on again is the permit limits, the effluent discharge limitations that are so core to the permit, kind of the heart, as I've been saying over and over again. So let's look at those. Let's see some actual examples. And then we're also going to look here at a little example of the monitoring requirements. So the top chart here is the Tree Mountain permit that we looked at the public notice for, and it's the effluent limitations for that permit. So who can tell me, I want to make a point here that reading these permits is both very, very easy and then also kind of hard when it comes to figuring out what it means. Let's focus on easy in the beginning. So who can tell me via chat, if you can, how much flow this facility is allowed to discharge and over what time period? Oh, good. Everybody's got the 2 million gallons per day, and it's per monthly average. So if you haven't found it, there it is. So pretty straightforward to kind of figure out how this chart works, right? How about how much biological oxygen demand, BOD5? Let me go here. Looks like you guys are getting a couple different answers. So yes, this is a good one. There's a couple answers here. I've circled here the minimum percent removal, which I should have specified my categories here. So that's they have
All
to.
guests have been muted.
Oh, there's our mute. The BOD5 has two limitations. They have to remove at least 85%, which is one I've circled in red. But just above it, you can see as a monthly average, they have to not exceed 25 milligrams per liter. So kind of a double answer there. And let me just get rid of that one. Okay, and how about what's the minimum amount of dissolved oxygen that can be in their waste stream? Five per day, 5 milligrams per liter per day. It's a daily minimum, not per day. So that you can see if you haven't spotted it already right there. Okay, and I'm trying to think if there was anything else I wanted to quiz you guys on here, but I think that was the main stuff I wanted to cover. One other thing I wanted to mention here, just for curiosity's sake, is a lot of these limitations that you're seeing here are really based on the National Secondary Treatment Standards that we talked about earlier. Exceptions include the E. coli numbers that are in here, bacteria, as well as oil and grease. I find the oil and grease one kind of interesting. Here in Utah, we do that based on best professional judgment. It's like 10 milligrams per liter daily maximum. And they just picked that number. So there's an example of the BPJ coming into play. So similarly here on the monitoring chart down below, you can see this is what's included in their permit in terms of required monitoring. So this is what they will be reporting, the data that we as the public will be able to see if they're complying with their requirements. So can anyone in the chat tell me how often they have to monitor for E. coli? Anybody got that one? Twice a week, Elizabeth says, and Nathan and Claudia. Okay, so if you haven't found it yet, there it is, 2 times a week. And they have to do it using a grab sample, you can see right there. So for each of the monitoring requirements, they say, kind of how often, what type of sample type they need to do, and then the units that are involved. So these should tie up to the effluent limits in the top chart. Similar things they should be monitoring for, and the data should allow them to see if they're actually meeting those effluent limits. In fact, allow you to see if they're meeting the effluent limits. So that's just a quick peek at a little set of effluent limits and then the monitoring requirements that you might see inside a permit. You can see it's pretty easy to figure out kind of what is being required. The question is, the harder part is, well, what do I think about this information? How do I write comments based on it? So that is a pretty big subject, and there's lots we could cover. For this 101, I wanted to give you just a few ideas and refer you to a resource. I'll give you the web address for this at the end of the session, but the resource is a guide produced by River Network and Prairie Rivers Network, and I think it was the Clean Water Network back in the day that I was working for, called Permitting an End to Pollution. And it is a how-to guide for commenting on permits, for getting into the nitty-gritty of those numbers that we just looked at. So I'll give you again that web address at the end of the session, but that would give you a lot more detail on kind of how to critique these effluent limits in other parts of the permit as you go. Here are just a few ideas, though. The easiest thing to do is to compare and contrast the permit you're looking at, your draft, with a previous permit if it's a renewal. So if you have a renewal situation, you can ask several really basic questions. Where is the proposed discharge? Sometimes you'll see that they're moving where the pipe comes out. Or they're adding discharge points. So there used to be one pipe and now there's 2 or 3. That can really change the effects of the discharge. Maybe they're moving from a big river to a smaller creek or vice versa. That will have a different impact on the system. So you might want to look and see what's going on with the discharge points themselves. You can look and see if those effluent limits are changing. Compare the old permit with the new permit, see what kinds of changes you're seeing, and start to try to figure out why. Ditto with the frequency of monitoring or the type of monitoring. And then we haven't talked much about water quality standards or at all in this presentation, but if the water quality standards in the receiving water in the river or the lake have changed, that should impact the permit. So you might want to see, well, what are the standards now in the stream, and are they different than when this last permit was written? So there's just a few ideas if you're facing a renewal. For just all permits, it could be asking some very basic questions like, is this facility allowing pollutants that are a particular concern? My example here is maybe a new discharge of bacteria near swimming areas. That might be something that you really want to take a look at. Another basic idea is to compare the effluent limits to those national technology-based effluent limitations or the secondary treatment standards that we talked about earlier. Just make sure that at the very least they're meeting that floor. And then what is the discharger's track record locally or nationally? We'll talk a little bit more about how to figure that out in the enforcement section here, but the basic idea here is if this is a discharger that is having a problem with complying with their permits, you might want to look particularly closely at what's required of them, particularly in terms of monitoring, et cetera, and try to get a handle on making sure that you can watchdog what they're up to through this permitting process. So with that, just quickly on submitting comments, a reminder, the public notice tells you where and when to send your actual comments. But it's just as important, arguably more important, to talk to the permit writers and others involved in the permitting process if at all possible. The basic idea here is if you have questions, you want to try to the extent you can to get those answered before submitting your official comments. So rather than asking a question in your comments and having the agency respond to that question with something that you want to respond to yourself, but you can't because the public comment period is closed, it would be better to have those discussions up front and have your final comments be things that address what they're going to say in response or what they would have if you hadn't already debunked their argument. So to the extent you can, try to really get in there and get your questions answered ahead of time. That said, raising questions and comments is a fair way to go, particularly if you cannot get answers, or if you know that they do not know what the answers to those questions are. That can be a whole other problem. But to the extent possible, try to get in and talk with the folks involved with the permit ahead of time. It'll make your comments stronger. And then lastly, remember you don't need to be an expert, but you do have to be factual and request specific action. So you don't need to be a biochemist, to look at this stuff necessarily. But if you are using any kind of data or information, make sure that you feel comfortable that it's factual. If possible, citations are good for keeping ourselves honest, and they also look pretty good when you're submitting your comments in terms of making it harder to debunk your arguments. And this last piece, request specific action. If there's a common weakness I see sometimes in the conservation community's comments, it's not requesting a specific action. We tend to critique and maybe complain, but it's important to also offer up a solution. It's a little bit Pollyanna. You think, oh, they're never going to listen to my solution. But you have to put it out there if you have something. Again, you don't have to solve every problem, but if there's something specific that you want the agency to do, say it. So if, one of your critiques is about the monitoring requirements, you want them to monitor more often for E. coli, say that. And if possible, say, I don't, once a month for E. coli monitoring is not cutting it. We need 3 times a week. And here's why. That's the kind of specificity that I think really makes it harder to just kind of walk away from your comments, but actually have to respond and hopefully address those comments if you're thinking as a state agency staff person. So try to be as specific as you can, but again, you don't have to be an expert. For more in-depth advice, again, on writing comments and kind of the format and the etiquette and things, see that Permitting an End to Pollution guide. There's some good information in there and references to other guides out there that can help you with that. I have a comment here that says it's also good to talk with the facility and maybe even follow up with the municipality afterward to build relationships. That's so true. Yeah, I mean, you want to do it so that you get the best information you can for your comments, but Jacqueline is exactly right. It's really a way to build kind of a relationship and have an ongoing discussion with the agency in terms of the permit writer, but also often with the discharger. I've never regretted it when I've had the time or made the time to have those discussions. Even if I don't get what I want, maybe on a particular permit, it opens a dialogue that can be really constructive in the future. So keep that in mind. That's good advice from Jacqueline. All right, so again, we're going to stop here for questions. So if you have a question, you can chat it. I'm not going to encourage you to unmute yourself because it seems to be a challenge to remember to remute. But if you want to, you can unmute yourself. In the meantime, I think that there are some questions. Forrest asked, where do we find Permitting an End to Pollution? I'm going to put up the URL at the end of the resources slide at the end of the presentation for us, so it's up for a little while. It's on River Network's website, but I'll give you the actual URL. Let me see, got a couple other comments here. Sometimes the permitting agency requires split sampling, so the agency verifies the sampling. So that is something people can ask for if there's any kind of questionable sampling. Good thought from Sarah. Forrest says polluters tend to behave differently if they know they're being watched. It's very true. All people, everyone, I think, acts differently if they know they're being watched. Jacqueline says, can you explain ambient versus absolute limits? I learned about this recently and felt like I should have understood that. Those aren't universal terms, Jacqueline, so I'm going to take a shot at it generally and tell me if this is what you think they meant by these. I'm guessing that ambient, usually you hear ambient in terms of ambient monitoring, which would be kind of in-stream monitoring, kind of what is going on in the environment, say downstream of a discharger. Whereas, if you're monitoring at the discharge itself, you're monitoring the discharge stream. And that wouldn't be ambient, that would be, the discharge. That'd be an effluent kind of situation. You're monitoring the effluent itself. So I'm not sure if perhaps they meant absolute in terms of the permit, and the ambient in terms of the in-stream water quality. That would be my guess. So if you have anything more on that, let me know. I'm just going to scroll back here to see if I missed any questions. Oh, Robert asked a question about monitoring. That says, how do you ensure they aren't monitoring at 2 a.m. or when the results are most agreeable to the permittee? Is that clear? You hear about this, and I'm sure it happens, and I'm sure it has happened and continues to happen. I think that would be the kind of thing that could be spelled out in a permit. I personally have not seen it done. I'm racking my brains if I should even say that. I can't think of an example of having seen it done, like say, monitor between 8 and 6 p.m. Or, mostly you hear about games played with dissolved oxygen because it goes up and down on kind of a cycle if you've got some problems in the system. So if anybody else in the chat window, if you've ever seen a permit that specified kind of some limitations on time for monitoring, I'd be curious to hear those examples. So if anybody has an answer for Robert, let me know. But I do know if you put it in the permit that they can't do that, that would be, an enforceable mechanism of the permit. Let's see if other questions have come up. Forrest says some during business hours, for example. So at least in some places, it sounds like in business hours would be a good way to do it. It's kind of, generic but understood that it should be during the heart of the day kind of thing. Okay, any other questions before we move on? Oh, Jacqueline did clarify on the ambient versus absolute. It looks like, yeah, it looks like the effluent limits were what they were talking about in terms of absolute and in-stream, how they changed the receiving water. Seems nebulous and hard to verify and comment on. Jacqueline, we might have to talk about that offline. I'd be curious to talk to you a little bit more about the context and try to give you something constructive to go on with that. So let me know if you want to follow up on that. Okay, so the next sections are kind of shorter. They're mostly a little more advanced, but they're issues I wanted to at least touch on so you all had some terminology in your head if you've heard about these things as you go. So this section in enforcement, we're going to talk about discharging without a permit, the discharge monitoring reports I mentioned earlier, and then just briefly talk about penalties and citizen suits. So quickly, we've already kind of touched on this. One of the things that the Act in this permit program makes clear is that it's illegal to discharge if you're a point source if you don't have a permit. So I just wanted to mention, we've been talking about the intricacies of these permits, but you can and also should identify illegal discharges. So if there's a point source out there and you can spot this pipe or other kind of evidence of a discharge and there's no permit for it, that is something that you should certainly raise with the agency and try to get some action on. There may be fines and penalties associated with that, and at the very least the requirement that they get a permit. Of course, then it has to be a good permit. But I didn't want to ignore the fact that one of the things watershed groups can do is pay attention to discharges that maybe exist illegally and really need to be brought into this regulatory system. So the other topic here that I think is really important for you all to take home is discharge monitoring reports. So their shorthand for these is DMR, Discharge Monitoring Report, and they are public information, and they are available from your state or EPA. So you can get your hands on the actual data that these discharges are reporting. I gave you one example here of an EPA website where you can access this information. I don't believe that it's a little hard to tell. This is by no means complete, this particular database, and certainly not historically complete, but it's a really good starting point and relatively easy to search on. You can also go to, Tim put up the ECHO database, which is an enforcement database. If you look in the chat window, he's got a link to another one. That was the other one I didn't put up because it was so darn long, but you can see he's got it in there. They have several of these types of databases out there that try to pull this data together. I'd basically advocate, unless your state is resistant, go to your state agency and try to get it. Go straight to the source. It seems easier to me, but maybe these tools are improving over time. So you can get hard copy usually, or they've got these electronic databases now. I wanted to show you an example of an old-fashioned paper discharge monitoring report here. This is not from our permittee in Utah, but from a permittee in Tennessee. And I just wanted to show you this example so you can see that it's pretty straightforward if you want to use this kind of information, either if you're looking at a permit renewal to see if there's any problems with the facility, or if you're just got a facility in your neighborhood that you want to watchdog. This is the source for that data. So a couple things you'll find here. One, the monitoring period is noted here. This is a month. This is August of 07, looks like 2007. So you can always find, the permit number is how you would track down this facility, and then you can see what time period you're looking at. And then they always tell you the sample measurement. So the sample measurement is the actual monitoring data that they're reporting here. And then they also always have the actual permit, or they should if they filled it out correctly, the permit requirement. So what is actually required for each of these parameters in their permit. So you can see it's like sample measurement, permit requirement for each, just over and over. Can anybody see if there's a violation on this discharge monitoring report, this DMR? Can anyone spot a problem that they're reporting? Oh, I thought you guys would be very fast on this. Maybe you've all fallen asleep on me. No one can see a violation here? Oh, I see some people typing. Okay. See, if we were face-to-face, I could have candy for the people with the first answers. But TSS, you guys have spotted it. So total suspended solids maximum. So if you look here, the gray area again is what the permit required. They said 40 milligrams per liter maximum. What they're reporting here is 541 milligrams per liter as their maximum concentration. So pretty big excursion there, as they call those. The other thing I'd point out is they're supposed to, 2 columns over where it says NOEX, it's number of exceedances. They didn't fill that in. They had at least one and maybe two to get to that reporting. So that also that's a paperwork violation. But technically, Barry Sulkin, who taught a lot of us how to read these, would point out that that's a violation. So they're not all going to be as sexy as this example, but I just wanted to show you all that they're relatively easy to read and pretty, direct to figure out. So well worth your time if you have a facility you're concerned about or just want to kind of get a handle on in your facility. Again, discharge monitoring reports. Fines and penalties, again, not going to go into great detail here. The main point of this slide is that if someone is found violating a permit, the fines and penalties can be pretty dramatic under the Clean Water Act, including citizen suits. So depending on the size of the violation and the length, some of these, there's a clock and they're per day, they can add up pretty quickly. So it isn't a small thing to violate your Clean Water Act permit. It can be a big hit to the bottom line for someone. So Nicole Barker has a question here of why wasn't the quantity or loading column filled out? Oh, I believe, I would bet, I don't remember the specifics of this permit from 2007. I would bet they do not actually have loading limits in this permit, and so they're not reporting on it. That would be my guess, Nicole, but I'm not sure. That's something that I've been kind of grumbly about here in my state, but I would guess that that's what we're seeing here. A good question. And you would want to go back perhaps and compare to the permit and see what they're supposed to be reporting on. All right, well, so that's fines and penalties. The short story is they can add up quickly and be pretty big. So it's not a small thing. The last enforcement subject I wanted to touch on so that you're aware of it is the importance of citizen suits to the Clean Water Act. So the basic message here is that the Clean Water Act, one of the really innovative things about it is that it made all of us kind of deputies. The citizen suit provision allows people like you and me, watershed groups and others, to serve as enforcers of the Clean Water Act, including these, the details of these permits we've been discussing. I'm going to touch on 3 basic things here, and again, this is more so you just have these concepts if you decide to go down this road and you know that you want to learn more about it. These are the types of things you might need to think about. So 3 basic concepts in the citizen suit arena is, we can bring these kind of enforcement cases against facilities, but you need to have standing. So what that means, again, in the gross generalization, is that you, meaning you, your watershed group, members of your watershed group, need to have some kind of real harm or impact from the violations that have been occurring. So usually that's something like, if you have members that fish or swim in the creek, and their use of the creek may have been impacted by the problems, even if it's theoretical, even if it's just people are concerned about swimming because they think it might be polluted kind of thing, and it's reducing their recreational use. That could be part of the issue for proving that you have standing. You also need an ongoing violation or something that's reasonably likely to recur. So, finding out that there was a problem back in 1977 that's never happened again, that's not going to be a candidate for a citizen suit. You need something that is either happening on an ongoing basis, or you can predict, hey, they haven't changed what they're doing. This is going to happen again the next time it rains or what have you. Lastly, you need to have kind of a clear playing field. You need to not have an agency, say your state water quality agency, that is taking enforcement action already. So we're deputies, but they kind of have the lead. And if they're taking action, they take precedence. So those are some things to keep in mind, but just know that this is a powerful tool that lots of groups use to good advantage. It's a tool you don't want to use willy-nilly, but it's there as a backstop if you need it. Ryan, I'm seeing at least one person that has no audio, so if there's some problem and I'm speaking to the air, that would be good to know, but it might be person-specific. Um, any questions on enforcement while we're, at least one person still hears me. A couple do. Okay, good. Any questions on that quick look at enforcement issues? All right. Well, we're going to move on really quickly here to just touch on a few special topics and then do a little wrap up. These, again, are things that I wanted to mention to you all. Some of them have come up in passing already. Um, but I want to just flag them for you as you start to think about getting more involved. So we're going to talk about each of these just briefly. So stormwater permitting under the NPDES program is kind of a different creature and a really interesting creature. There's several types of stormwater permits, municipal permits, industrial permits, and construction stormwater permits. And each of them is, again, kind of its own creature. It's a whole other world that my colleague Gail Killam is very much an expert on. She's going to be giving an entire webinar on this topic of NPDES permits for stormwater. And that's going to be held Monday the 10th. So if you haven't already RSVP'd for that, you can do so on the same form, the same site that you RSVP'd for this session. I know a lot of you signed up for both, but if you haven't, you may want to sign up for that. Oh, hold on. I see a question here. And we've also put the link to RSVP in the chat box if you're interested. So Ron asked, successive suits, anybody actually win in the past? Yes, people do win cases, Ron. They're not, they're not necessarily a slam dunk, and they can be very resource intensive. But citizen suits are, a pretty useful tool. So I can't tell you, 50%. I don't think there's ever been an analysis, and if there was, it was immediately out of date. But they can be successful and have been, and frankly, even just the fact that they can happen is often a really strong negotiating tool if you're seeing problems. So you'll want to be strategic in the use of that. You don't want to hang threats over people's heads or what have you. But just the fact that people have the power to do that can sometimes bring people to the table. But in cases where they're filed, they can be successful. If anybody has a chat example that they want to throw up there of a case that they've been involved with, might be interesting for people to see. All right, so the next special issue I wanted to touch on was the CAFO issue, concentrated animal feeding operations. Again, we've touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to mention that these are another kind of different permit that you may come across. These CAFOs are defined largely based on the size of the facilities, so the number of animal units, and some other factors. They usually are general permits, nearly always, and they're usually what are called best management practice based. So they're telling facilities things like how to manage their manure, maybe how much freeboard they need in one of those big manure lagoons, or issues of spreading the manure on the ground. Those types of things are addressed in these permits. So they're really different looking than a lot of the traditional, wastewater treatment plant kind of permits. This is an area I used to work on a lot. If people have questions on it, I'd be happy to talk to you offline. But it's certainly a NPDES permit, and a lot of the same requirements apply. The permits themselves are just quite different, so I wanted to mention that. And then this last special topic, I wanted to mention this, and this might even go back a little bit to some of the ambient discussion that we were having in chat earlier, but I wanted to touch on mixing zones as an example of some of the complicated issues that do come up in these permitting decisions and discussions. So a mixing zone is essentially a zone of dilution in a way. We've been talking about effluent limits as the limits that are put on a facility of what they can discharge basically at the end of their pipe. So if you're looking at this picture, right at the end of the pipe. Of course, that discharge then goes into the stream and mixes with the water in the stream or a lake or what have you. And what mixing zones are is they say, well, we're going to kind of define an area where what's coming out of the pipe is going to be diluted by the flow in the water body, and we're just going to be okay with the fact that in that zone we might not meet water quality standards. We'll define that zone, and we'll allow it to serve to dilute the pollution that's coming out of this facility. So this is an extremely complicated issue, but I wanted to put it up there as kind of an example of if you're looking at a permit, there's going to be a lot of these other kinds of issues that may come up. Not in every permit, but as you get more involved, you're going to see these. This is the type of issue, again, that's addressed in Permitting an End to Pollution, and there's other resources online for these very technical, in-depth issues like mixing zones. So I think that was my last special topic. Again, just kind of an example of the more complicated things you might see. Any questions on that before we go into some resources and kind of action ideas? Oh, here some people are in chat sharing some specifics about different, looks like permitting decisions they've been involved with. So if you're curious, there's some good discussion happening there about, like Charlene asked, how these citizen suits impact the relationship with stakeholders in the long run. And Forrest's answer is kind of what I was alluding to. People know that you have a hammer you're willing to use, and it makes them a little more cautious. That unfortunate, threat kind of hanging is a powerful tool, but one to be used carefully and cautiously. But you can see that discussion over in chat. Any other questions before we do a little wrap-up? No? Okay, well then moving on. In terms of wrap-up, I mostly wanted to just summarize a few things on the action ideas, and then again I'm going to wrap up with the resources and give you a last chance to ask some questions. So in terms of influencing permit, it's kind of the public comment stuff that we were talking about. As a wrap-up, remember, its first step is to get on those public notice mailing lists. And I probably should have put on here, get to know your state agency permitting staff. I think both of those things are really important to staying in the loop and kind of understanding what's going on. So getting those notices in-house and having a relationship or relationships with the people who are involved in permitting. Then, of course, review the permits, and where appropriate, take advantage of that chance to comment. You really need to do that in order to have any hope at making change. And I didn't mention this, but it also preserves your ability to do things like challenge the permits later. If you're not involved with the process, you lose certain rights to be involved later. And then, track the permit locations and identify cumulative impacts of discharges or mixing zones. That's a little more advanced idea, but the idea here is, if you're tracking these permits and commenting, one of the things you can be commenting on that frankly might get lost in the individual permit, kind of decisions that are made is things like the cumulative impacts in your watershed. So you might be in a unique position to say, yes, this facility that's proposed in front of us today looks like a small deal, but if you add it to the 3 upstream that we've permitted over the last year, let's talk about cumulative impacts and really start to make a broader case for your watershed. So there's just some very basic action ideas there. And in terms of enforcement, one of the things I didn't mention, but I wanted to make sure to at least give a nod to here, is a lot of watershed groups have monitoring programs, volunteers getting out there and taking data. One of the things you might decide to do is to monitor below outfalls, or even better, above and below, a discharge pipe or outfall, and start to get a feel for kind of what's happening in the stream as a result of what you're seeing in the permits. You can also review the discharge monitoring reports, as we talked about. That actually is really fun. If you're at all interested, you'll be addicted in short order if you start to do that, and particularly if you just have several facilities you're concerned about. You can track implementation of best management practices required by permits. This can be a bit of a challenge, but some of these permits do require kind of practices to be applied on the ground. One example would be concentrated animal feeding operations, where again, maybe it's the freeboard in a lagoon, or land application of manure is one of the practices that's kind of controlled by the permit. It can be a challenge in terms of, getting onto, you don't want to trespass on private land, but some of these you can tell, you can monitor visually from afar, so you could be tracking that. And lastly, there may be changes that you want to push for, reopening of permits and enforcement of permits based on total maximum daily loads that are developed for your watershed, those watershed restoration plans that we mentioned briefly earlier. So you might be the voice for making sure that what is required in those watershed restoration efforts under TMDLs comes back into action with your permits. So wait, there's some chat going on over here. Okay, cumulative impacts are important. Oh, here's a comment from Sarah that says, when making comments in Utah on an UPDES permit, that's what we call them, the new Utah administrative rules require that if you want to appeal, the issue must be brought up during the comment period. And I read that out loud because that's pretty typical, very typical, and a real reason to comment on facilities you're concerned about is, again, you're preserving your right to get involved later. So that's a really great point, Sarah, and broadly applicable in other states. So while we're wrapping up, I want to put these up so that these resources are here if you want to jot any of them down. If you missed something, I can also email it to you, of course. But these are some of the resources we've talked about during the webinar, especially permitting an end to pollution. Several people asked about that URL, and there it is. We also have a Clean Water Act online course that covers a lot of information about the Clean Water Act, including point source permits, but also related issues that we only mentioned here, like water quality standards and total maximum daily loads and those kinds of topics. So you can go to that cleanwateract.org and take the course or pieces of it. And then the US EPA's main NPDES page I've provided here, because there's a lot of good information beyond what I showed you there. And just, the last bullet there is just a reminder that your state agency's webpage itself and the actual humans are one of your best resources. It's easy to get into adversarial kind of feelings when you're writing public comments and arguing over these permit limits, but these folks really know a lot about permitting and often about the facilities you're looking at. So establishing that relationship is really important. You can read every guidebook in the world, but having that human kind of contact is going to be critical to success. So those resources are there. I'm just going to scan back while you are looking at these to see if I've missed any questions here. So Nathan said, I've heard that there's a policy known as anti-backsliding involved in NPDES permit modification, but what exactly does it require? Okay, that is definitely a more advanced topic, Nathan, and with 1 minute left in the session, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to do it justice. So two quick answers. Three quick answers. One, if you guys would like a more advanced NPDES training, put that in the evaluation that's going to pop up at the end of this webinar, and we could address some topics like anti-backsliding and maybe even get some good legal experts in to help with that. Two, the online course, which is on this slide here, has some information on anti-backsliding you could check out. Ditto for NPDES, the NPDES homepage. I'm sure they have some information there. And third, I'd be happy to talk to you in more detail about it, Nathan. So if you want to email or call, feel free to follow up. I'm sorry we don't have time to really address that here. Any other kind of quick questions or any additional resources that people want to recommend in the chat window for your colleagues before we wrap up? I can see some typing is going on over there, so we'll hold up here for a second while I remind you that when we do wrap up here, there's going to be an evaluation form that pops up for you, and everybody says this, but we really mean it. We obsess over these evaluations. So if you have a second to fill it out, please do. It really helps us improve these, whether it's technical issues like the sound or substance, things we should do a better job on in terms of content. You can also recommend additional webinars you'd really like to see us do, and we'll make sure to add those to the list of things to do. So with that, it looks like I'm not seeing any additional questions or resources pop up. Just a lot of thanks. So I think I will go ahead and wrap up. Again, if anybody needs to follow up with me, it's M as in Merritt, Frey, at rivernetwork.org. And thanks so much for sticking with a pretty intense session. Thanks.